Hey everyone, welcome again from Quarantine Central here. I read through your discussion board posts and really enjoyed checking it out. You should be clear, I respond to every post, so you want to look back on there. Because the discussion board, writing back to you all is so time consuming, I can only really respond once back on there. I know sometimes you write back, which is fine. I try to read that, but I can't really keep responding back because we have new discussion board posts to do. Also, just important if to get those in on time. I don't really take late discussion board posts because again, it's so much work to read through them all and respond. I can't keep going back and looking at older posts when people kind of post them up there. So just try to stay timely on that itself, and people are getting better in terms of being more specific about the post and citing certain pages and expanding upon your ideas. Hopefully this all helps come to a better understanding of the material that we're grappling with. This a reminder too, next week we're going to be meeting in person finally to talk about all three of the films in many ways and how they relate and sort of the writing assignment regarding them, and obviously Naked City that you're watching for this week. I am really excited. I mean, film noir is one of my favorite areas, and I have to refrain from showing too much of it in any class itself. I have it peppered throughout the syllabus, and I never have done the Naked City before, which I'm sort of interested to hear your comments on it itself. Many of you probably have heard of film noir before. It's a really interesting. I mean, there's debates if it's a style or a genre or a time period. The height of noir in many ways from the early 40s to the late 50s. There's things called obviously neo noir now, but it's a really international movement in all aspects, and that's what makes it really, really fascinating. As the name implies, it was named by French critics in 1946 after the war, right? France, there was a boycott of films coming to France at that time. So suddenly they had an influx of American cinema coming in, and they noticed this kind of dark trend coming there, and they deemed it film noir. In many ways, film noir wouldn't have been possible without the emigration of German directors and camera people coming over to the U.S. during the 1920s and 1930s. A lot of the big film noir directors were of German background and very influential, and probably one of the most influential camera people, Karl Freund, who did some early Universal horror films, was very influential too. As I mentioned, it's predominantly during the 1940s and 50s really where it started peaking. And again, it's debatable if it's a style or a genre or things like that. Makes film noir really interesting is often the best films are B films. This week's film is not a B film, but it is a low budget. Universal was probably the most broke of this Hollywood studios were known as the Big Eight at the time when this was going on. And there was the Big Five and sort of the Little Three, and Universal was a part of the Little Three, along with like Columbia Pictures was also fairly broke compared to something like MGM that had a lot of money, or Warner Brothers that had a bit of money itself. So Universal was definitely the more broke of the major studios, and that's partially why they did horror films in the 30s, because they were cheap to produce, and film noir similarly felt that thing. So The Naked City is one of the cheaper productions that Universal produced. Film noir has a lot of elements to it, far too many to mention here, but one is a sense of post-war disillusionment with the way in which society is going. It's often been referenced as the dark mirror, right, of representing kind of the dark side of America. Has this kind of post-war realism, which I'll go into a little later, speaking about the particular time period about The Naked City coming out. As I mentioned, has a strong German influence. Also comes from this hard-boiled tradition, which one of the essays mentions. Hard-boiled is referring to the literary work of people like Raymond Chandler and the like of that, coming out of this detective genre at the time. And also not relevant necessarily for today's film, but changing roles of women during and after the war. So the femme fatale starts emerging. But this film doesn't really have that occurring in it. So in some ways, that's not germane to this discussion. There are three phases of classic noir. This was came up with by Paul Schrader, who you might know most best as a scriptwriter for Taxi Driver or a scriptwriter for Last Temptation of Christ. He also has done his own films like Blue Collar and other things like that. He also wrote about noir. So there's the first period in 1941 to 46, the Private Eye and the Lone Wolf, type of noir. That's sort of double indemnity that's mentioned in that one article that I didn't have you necessarily read. The Maltese Falcon, things like that are going on. Then there's 1945 to 49, the post-war realistic period, often about crime in the streets, political corruption, etc. And that is where the Naked City sort of emerges out of. It's a part of this time period, often called the semi-documentary film that's emerging at that time. And then later, 49 to 53, a period of psychotic action and suicidal impulses. White Heat comes to mind during that. James Cagney's insane film that he does from that time period. Also, Kiss Me Deadly, which is one of my favorite films where the world sort of blows up at the end of it. I want to talk a little bit about this 45, 49 period. Naked City emerges in 48, comes out in 48, won a couple of awards, cinematography and editing. It's referred to as a semi-documentary, which a couple films had preceded, and it has very, hybrid influences on it. So the two articles I had you read, one deals particularly with the second point here, the pulp photography and fiction that influenced the Naked City. There's a photographer named Ouija who actually produced a book called The Naked City in 1945, and one of the articles has a series of his photographs. Ouija was particularly really influential to photographers at that time. A family member of ours, older one who's passed away now, but was a photographer in that period, and he handed me off a copy of Ouija's book a long time ago. So I can't overemphasize how influential it was. Another thing, no surprise, here is Italian neorealism, though it's a mixed heritage that comes from there. And the article written by Rebecca Prime really gets into this, and I have a discussion board post that I have listed right now that asks you about this, the film's relationship to Italian neorealism. So I'm not going to say much about that. You can read it in the article, and we'll discuss it on the discussion board. Also, it's influenced by a documentary tradition, and particularly new documentaries that were coming out. One by Pere Lorentz, The Plow That Broke the Plains, which is a government-produced film, actually, that came out in 1935 itself. So, yeah, and obviously you have German Expressionism also, which I don't have explicitly listed here. But it's less so, that's less so an imprint on the films from this period than it is the earlier version. It has much more documentary feel. Prime also mentions this really great point that the Naked City kind of emerges during this conservative moment in American history. After World War II, Roosevelt dies. In many ways, the New Deal ethics start giving way to a rise of conservatism, and particularly HUAC, the House of Un-American Activities Committee. Right, the film comes out right when HUAC is coming into full prime. One of the screenwriters, Albert Maltz, for The Naked City, gets prosecuted as the Hollywood 10. He was a communist and tried to make modest, changes in Hollywood to bring more progressive content to the screen. And Dazin also had his own kind of mixed relationship with Hollywood. So the film that he envisioned, as Prime talks about, is not the one that you're going to see. Sadly, he feels like it was sort of taken away from him at that time. I should be clear, there were conservative movements in Hollywood prior to 1947 and the rise of HUAC, but they never kind of took hold. For example, in 1939, there was a conservative congressperson who went to Hollywood at the time trying to root out communism and stupidly accused Shirley Temple of being a communist, the most beloved child actor at the time, because she had within her films Bill Bojangles, who's an African-American dancer, and this suggested communist influences. You can see how communism is totally simplified in this conservative account to associate anybody who sees cross black and white alliances as potentially subversive, and also shows the deep racism of the United States that accuses anybody who wants to cross black and white racial differences as somehow subversive. Things to think about while watching the film. One, how are neorealistic techniques being integrated into it? Where do we see the imprints going on? The article mentions Rome Open City and the influence upon Dawson. We've obviously seen the bicycle thieves, so where do you feel certain parts that resonate with it? On a similar thought line, what serious differences does the film have with Italian neorealism? Many assume that films coming out from this period are fairly conservative in their outlook. Often earlier noir films are very critical of the police, critical of main institutions. This film, we follow cops. So is this a pro-cop film in your mind? Is it fairly conservative of reinforcing the police and what they do? Why or why not do you think that's true? And then finally, I'd like you to think more broadly, what links do you see with Stray Dog? Which is, guess what, another cop film that we watched. So it's interesting to think in relationship with that film to this one and what they're saying to each other. And we'll talk about all this on Tuesday. I look forward to hearing what you think, in addition to what you write about the discussion board and its relationship to Italian neorealism. And we can go over stuff there. So 1 o'clock on Tuesday, we will meet finally synchronously to talk about this stuff and voice any questions that you have. Hope you enjoy the film, and see you soon.